Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie Friedhof. I'm a journalist and I run programming at the Nieman Foundation for Journalism here at Harvard. And about 10 days ago, I was sitting in a boardroom on the 7th floor of the journalism school at Columbia University in New York. And the room was not as fancy as it may sound. There were no windows. And we were huddled around that long table like a trial jury, only it wasn't a criminal case we were judging, it was journalism. 12 examples of excellent, insightful journalism from around the country and around the world. Amid the finalists for the Start Award for Excellence in Coverage of Trauma were powerful newspaper series and radio programs put together by experienced journalists working for large media organizations. And then there was the compelling, straightforward prose of a single person, a veteran, no less, writing short pieces for the New York Times at War blog. James Brennan, who's with us here tonight, writes about what it takes for a Marine to admit that he needs help with the psychological impact of war. He tells us not just about his traumatic brain injury, but about his 220,000 fellow veterans afflicted by the same injury. And he takes us to the inner workings of the epidemic of suicide that has taken a hold among returning veterans. Unlike so many other families, mine was lucky. He writes in one of his posts, "I came home, not the same person, but I was home. I struggled daily. Life without me in it became my fascination. Daydreaming became my escape from reality. I would imagine my daughter riding her bike for the first time without me, or my wife at the altar remarrying years later. I was physically present, yet mentally troubled with thoughts of my demise." In his writing, TJ meshes personal survivor narrative with traditional, thorough, fact-based reporting. In a way, it's a new form of journalism emerging from a new emerging journalist. Now, I've gotten permission to share with you tonight that tomorrow the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma will announce that TJ is receiving an honorable mention for his writing, right along with the New York Times Magazine and the York Daily News. To appreciate how remarkable this is, you have to know that TJ has been a journalist for exactly 2 months. He started writing these posts while still on base, then medically retired just this January and took a job as military affairs reporter with the Daily News in Jacksonville, North Carolina. Congratulations, TJ, from me as well. Now, we would not be here tonight were it not for Finbarr O'Reilly, a 2013 Nieman Fellow and photojournalist with the news agency Reuters. Finbarr himself just got an award, or I should say another award, since he has won a World Press Photo of the Year and many other awards, when it was announced that the documentary Under Fire about journalists in combat, which includes Finbarr and the journalists that are being profiled, just won a Peabody. Finbarr and TJ met in Afghanistan when O'Reilly embedded with the 1st Battalion 8th Marines. They shared hardships and fears, and TJ's dented metal canteen cup.
Which we have, actually. He just brought it tonight.
Did you not bring one?
Yeah.
This is the first time the two of them will be on stage together, having the kind of exchange that they have had privately for the past 2.5 years. Hashing out what it means to fight war, to document war, to be both enthralled and repulsed by war, to lose faith in war, to lose faith in the power of photography, and to not being able to let go of war once you're back and would very much like to. Tonight's conversation will happen at the intersection of writing and war, of journalism and trauma, of private experience and public policy. This is an important conversation to have today, as at least a third of the 1.7 million veterans who have returned from Iraq and Afghanistan suffer from PTSD. And so do about a third of the journalists who've covered these wars. It's also an important conversation because too often journalism focuses on the first draft of history and pays little attention to the first draft of memory. Memory, the British journalist and author Roger Cohn once wrote, "Memory sustains identity." Indeed, national identity is inconceivable without memory. But it may also lapse or be manipulated into the myth or madness that sustain the frenzy of nationalism. Memory is shifting, uneasy, potent, felt in the mind, but tied to the heart. Journalism, says Cohn, must concern itself equally with memory and history, the felt past and the factual past, in its attempt to paint the deepest, most truthful, and most vivid of pictures. This is exactly the kind of difficult work that Finbarr and TJ are attempting to do in their work every day and do so well. I'm delighted to share these two with you tonight for the kind of conversation that we had up in that boardroom at Columbia. Only we were talking heads then, and tonight we have the practitioners of the art. We're going to start with Finbarr showing a little clip about the day that TJ was injured. We will then take you into really the sensual reality of what it is like to be in combat. If you're sensitive to these kind of images, you might want to step out of the room for about 5 minutes when we come back to the conversation. Okay, Finbarr?
Cat 2 actual, this is 1 actual. Gunshot on his right leg. There is entry and exit 1 with a tourniquet on his right leg. Break.
Decorez, this is Coonjack. Are you copying the transmissions from the CP?
I looked back and I saw the warhead. It was coming straight towards Chun and I. I told Chun to get down. We both hit the deck. I don't remember the boom. All I remember is after the smoke had cleared, I saw Staff Sergeant Gonzalez running towards us, screaming my name. My name is Thomas Brennan. I'm a sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. I'm with 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, Alpha Company, and I'm the squad leader for 3rd Platoon, 4th Squad. The objective was to push up approximately 4,000 meters to a target building to potentially ambush the Taliban. We left Opie Coonjack at about 1,300. We pushed down into the city in a book. Once we got down there, we probably patrolled in about 400 or 500 meters, and that's when we started taking pretty heavy volumes of fire.
Hey, we're moving! What? They're moving! I'm moving!
We wound up maneuvering on them. We made it about another 75 meters down the road where we hit an open field, and that's where we started taking AK and RPK fire. We set up shop inside a compound. We had the security out there. We had the AMP with the RPK, and I had a saw gunner out there, and I had one of my team leaders out there with the 203 providing suppression. I had Lance Corporal Roche and Lance Corporal Orr moved to the next alleyway to set up our next mounting position, and that's when they got hit with an RPG. We thought they stepped on a pressure plate and got blown up by an IED at first, but then we seen them running back. They were pretty dazed. They suffered grade 2 concussions. We had the corpsman set them inside the compound, take a look at the two of them, and that's when myself and Lance Corporal Chun, we ran up to the same alleyway. That's when him and I got knocked out by an RPG that the AMP shot. It hit the telephone pole right next to me. Him and I both suffered 3rd grade concussions. My head really started hurting. I started having trouble seeing. My eyes hurt like hell. I kind of sounded dumber than I used to be because words weren't making sense in my head. But after about 2 days, my eyes started getting back to normal. I could start to focus, trying to piece it all together, but it's all kind of blurry. My squad watched 4 people get hurt. My team leaders still kept doing their job. My junior Marines still kept doing their job. And even the guys that got hurt by the concussions, we were still trying to the best of our ability to do our job. I'm just really proud of my guys, and I can't wait to get back to them and let them know. It's kind of hard to explain. We came together, family sticks together, and as long as I'm good to be out there, I want to be out there with them. We got HESCO barricades as our primary means of defense to keep the enemy out. In our living quarters, we have cami netting over the top. We paid $35 for a giant trash bag to drape over the top of that. That way, you know, since it started to rain a little bit, it'll keep us somewhat dry. But for the most part, it's dusty. It's getting cold. We got the solar showers, but pretty much we rely on baby wipes and clean socks. I showered once at Kunjak in the month I was there, just because the water was too damn cold. Baby wipes get the job done. And we got cots and just whatever our family send us. I miss my wife and daughter. My wife sends me photos of my daughter, and she's just growing up and getting so smart without me being there. It's kind of scary leaving when she's 2 and getting home when she's almost 3, and you miss so much. Being afraid of where you're walking each day, that definitely takes a toll on you. The psychological aspect is tremendous here. Their placement of IEDs, they know exactly where you're going to take cover when they start shooting, so they put them there. So you got to be careful where you run to once you start getting shot at. They've got IEDs on the corners, they've got IEDs in the middle of the roads, and they're only going to strike you with an ambush if it's advantageous to them. You just got to trust your eyes and trust your sweeper up front with the metal detector. One thing I always tell my guys is if today's the day, today's the day. I mean, we do everything we can. There's only so much you can do. The mission can't stop because you're nervous. You got to put one foot in front of the other and just keep going, because if you don't, you'll be standing still, and that makes you an easy target. You could walk up and talk to a local national, and he seems like a straight-up guy, but then 2 days later, you could be detaining him because he was shooting at you. Where they don't wear uniforms, you can't tell the good guys from the bad guys until you catch them doing something guilty. That's got to be the most frustrating thing about it. Before, we couldn't make it 100 meters into the city without getting shot at. Now we can make it 500, 600, 700 meters into the city before we get shot at. So we know we're pushing them back. And I noticed when we went on a patrol that more people were starting to come back. I mean, it's a slow process. You know, every 500 meters we push them back, you know, that allows 100 meters worth of civilians to come back into the city. But if we can get them back to their homes, and then we can really start trying to make a difference by telling them, like, listen, we pushed the Taliban back. You're back in your home. We're keeping you safe. You know, now help us out. The biggest accomplishments to myself are we found the IEDs that they've put out there for us. Nobody's been killed yet from the squad. And we've also killed Taliban. So, in my opinion, on the squad level, that's winning the war. Bigger picture is a lot bigger than I am. I know I'm a piece of the puzzle, and you know, if we're not doing our job, then the rest of the puzzle can't fit together. My guys have to trust me, I need to trust my leaders. If I trust them and accomplish the mission they want done, then the bigger picture will fall into place.
Reactional, this is CP. It's 3-3, taking contact. Roger, I'm copying 34.35, plain text.
I thought I'd just show you a little bit about what it feels like to be on patrol. It's about a 1-minute clip just going through the towns where TJ was working. That's Outpost Kunjak there. Well, right now we're patrolling through the town of Nabuk, which is a place where these guys took a lot of contact while I was here last time, and where Sergeant Brennan, who's leading this patrol, was hit by an RPG and suffered a concussion. So the town's a lot quieter than it was a couple months ago, and we haven't come under fire yet. So it's a little different, whereas last time when I was here 3-4 months ago, contact every time we were here.
Thank you so much, Finbarr. So we're going to have a conversation for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we're going to take questions from all of you. So I was going to start out by asking you, Finbarr, obviously you met TJ in Afghanistan. Tell us a little bit about how you got there. How did you get into this assignment?
Sure. So this was in 2010 when I first met TJ, but it was not my first time in Afghanistan. I started going there in 2007. I'm normally based in Africa, but I went to Afghanistan because I was interested actually in what the Canadians were doing there. I'm Canadian myself, so I wanted to see what the Canadian fighting force, which had a big presence, was doing when much of the attention at that time from the media was focused on Iraq. So I did a number of embeds, first in Kandahar province with the Canadians, and then also with the US Army, also in Kandahar province. And after, I think this was probably my fourth or fifth embed, each time about 6 weeks. And anytime I'd done a couple of medevac embeds with the US Army, where we were flying in and picking up injured civilians or Afghan armies or Taliban or any of the coalition forces who'd been injured in combat. And I knew my next embed was coming up with the Marines, and every time I said the Marines, they're like, "Oh, we'll have fun with that." They live hard, really hard. And when I was on all these other embeds, we had pretty good food, fresh food. Sometimes lobster was brought in. On Canada Day, we had beers and comfortable beds, armored containers that we were sleeping in. If you're at one of the bigger bases, you would have big gyms, like a gym you would have here, like a fully equipped gym with rowing machines and all these other kinds of things. I got to Kunjak, you saw it, it's the size of 2 tennis courts. These guys were sleeping in bunks, and probably the worst coffee I've ever tasted is served by the US Marine Corps. So I got to this tiny little outpost, and I kind of felt like the only way that I could really tell a story from a place like this was to spend time with one group of guys for the duration of my time there, rather than, the temptation is to try and go and find where the action is and try and get something that's kinetic and exciting, and we'll have dramatic war pictures. But I thought, let me just find a group of guys who I can fit with, and that's basically what happened. I turned up at this tiny little outpost. It's, as you saw, it's a beautiful, sparse landscape. When you look at it for a long time, it doesn't feel so beautiful, does it? No. Especially when you're standing up on post for how many hours? 4-hour shifts?
4 hours at a time.
4-hour shifts up on post, lookout. But it's a stunning landscape, and I just thought this could be an amazing backdrop if I can find a bunch of guys who are open to my being there and open to my telling their story as I see it. And I think on my first or second, I think it was my first day there, I'd set up in a little corner of this place that was empty, and I thought, this is great, I've got like lots of room, that'd be nice. And then at about 4 o'clock, his squad rolls in and just throws all their stuff down on top of mine. And I'm like, oh, great, here we go. And TJ rolled up and he said, who are you? And I said, I was a journalist. And he sort of looked at me and was like, okay, I guess you can bunk here or whatever. And then we just kind of started talking.
So, TJ, what was that like for you? This journalist coming in, done in fatigues, wanting to play war. What did that feel like for you?
I was extremely nervous at first, just because when I was in Fallujah back in 2004, journalists showed only the bad things that Marines did. They didn't show the good things. So I was nervous that he was going to betray our trust by only showing negative aspects of war. And I strategically placed myself right next to him and told my guys not to talk to him, not to go near him, let me feel him out first and see what was, you know, what his intentions were and what he wanted to cover before we all opened up to him. And once I did that, I mean, we invited him. We had a fire pit in the back where we cooked chicken and all sorts of vegetables and whatnot, almost on a nightly basis. And you know, as soon as we felt him out, he was family. And less than 24 hours after being there, we were pinned down in an alleyway together.
Yeah, so it was the day after that first meeting. First patrol we went on, actually. Yeah,
first patrol after we met, we were pinned down for about 45 minutes. And, I mean, you learn how to trust somebody real quick when you're under fire.
So, the night before you were injured, TJ, you and Finbarr had a long conversation.
We had lots of long conversations because our bunks were side by side. As he said, he positioned himself strategically to block me from the rest of the guys.
Yes.
But it stayed like that.
Which is what a real leader will do.
Right. But it stayed like that. Our bunks ended up really just side by side. We were sleeping for however long it was that first time, about a month, that far away from one another. Kept inhaling his cigarette smoke. But yeah, we had many late night conversations. In this
I'd love for TJ to tell us what he talked with you that night before he got injured.
I'd need to backtrack about a week and a half when João Silva lost his legs, and he videotaped or photographed the whole thing.
Yeah, well, João Silva is a photographer for the New York Times, and it was the same day that we got pinned down. That first day, I got back, and as I was filing my pictures, I got an email from somebody at the Kandahar base saying that João had been injured. He'd stepped on a landmine and lost both his legs.
And to go off of that, there's a lot of people don't know about the traumatic brain injuries or the post-traumatic stress disorder that comes out of Afghanistan and Iraq. And I told him that if anything was to ever happen to me, no matter how traumatic it is, I want the world to know. Just because it's an important tale to tell. And then the next day, lo and behold, I get blown up. And I mean, for lack of better terms. And the first thing he asked me was, "You remember what we talked about last night?" And I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Are you sure you want me to put this out there?" And I told him, "Yeah." And the impact that it had for people to see the untold stories of war was just phenomenal.
So Finbarr, tell us a little bit what you did once TJ got injured.
Well, so as you can imagine, it's a combat situation. Things are moving quickly. It was clear that the injuries weren't the kind that you might normally associate with a battlefield injury. These guys were concussed and kind of staggering around and disoriented, but they weren't the kind of visible injuries where you could see blood and this kind of thing. But it was clear that we had to call off, they had to call off the mission that they were doing and call for a medevac to get these guys out. But they were in a village, so we had to get them to an access point first. But do you remember that one of the vehicles blew up on the way? They hit an ID.
No.
So one of the evacuation vehicles. So you couldn't get them out by helicopter. We had to come and extract them first by foot, then by vehicle. But one of the vehicles got blown up on the way in. And so I was just kind of monitoring the situation. And you don't want to get in the way there as a journalist if people are giving first aid, which the corpsman was doing. And so these are people who I've been like living side by side, sleeping side by side. And so I take a few pictures within the context of what's happening without getting in the way. And then it's like somebody gets some water, somebody gets some sunglasses. And so, I handed a bottle of water. I got his sunglasses had been knocked off or been taken off at some point. So I just found them because with the concussion, it was very bright. You can see him in one of those pictures covering his face from the sun. And then we started to move to get these guys to the vehicle. So I was just kind of moving with the flow of what was happening.
And then your reporting about this ended up in the Lens blog, is that correct?
Yeah, so the New York Times Lens blog does this pictures of the day, and they've been featuring a number of my images over the course of my time with TJ's squad. And a reader and the editor noticed that there had been one picture, the one shown with him sitting in his bunk surrounded by his pictures of his family, and then the next day or 2 days later it was a picture of him injured. And they said, could you write a piece about what it's like being embedded and so close to your subjects when one of them gets injured? And that was that's when I first wrote about the relationship between journalist and subject in that kind of situation.
And then TJ, you were so deeply moved by the piece that you wrote a thank you letter.
When I got home from Afghanistan, I was home for about 6 months, and I hadn't picked up a pen since high school. I was in creative writing club for 10th and 11th and 12th grade, and I finally decided, you know what, he made such a big impact on me, I wanted to write him a thank you letter about his professionalism, about telling my story, showing the world what traumatic brain injury is and how big it is in the war. And I just wrote it, probably about 15 drafts before I decided I was ready to send it. And the editor that had published his Lens blog had messaged me on Facebook just to say, hey, hope you're doing well, hope you're healing up good. So I decided, well, if I'm going to send an article to a journalist, I might want to make sure I don't sound, like a dumbass. And I reached out to him and said, will you proofread this for me? And his words back to me were, "I love it, let's publish it." So me being 25 years old at the time, hadn't written anything in a year and a half, a guy from the New York Times says, "Hey, let's publish this." I would have been stupid not to. So lo and behold, about a month and a half later, he got an email saying, "Hey, check out the Lens blog," and I got yelled at for ambushing him as a Marine would.
Yeah, as a Marine, I totally wasn't expecting it. Normally, if the New York Times uses something, or an editor uses something, they tell me before, and I just get a message saying, check the site. What is this about? And there was this piece that was very touching and moving, and it was, okay, you can talk about awards, but that doesn't mean as much as something as heartfelt as this. This letter that was, on its own would have been fine, but putting it out publicly was something else entirely. But it was one of the more valuable experiences I've had just reading that. So thanks again for that.
By the way, these pieces that TJ wrote are not behind the paywall. You can just Google his last name, Brennan, and that war, and you'll immediately find them and be able to read them. We'll come back to the journalism. I wanted you, TJ, to talk a little bit to us about your traumatic brain injury, how you sort of first learned about it, did you see the brain scan? What did that look like? What did it do to you? What's that experience?
I first knew something was wrong. I spent 15 days in the hospital when I got medevaced out, and I really didn't know anything that was going on. But when I got back to my squad and I was patrolling every single day, I'd realized that I was forgetting things way more than I used to. They're called ZAP numbers, which is what you call in when somebody needs to get medevaced. It's like every Marine has one. And I had all of them memorized. I had the medevac procedures memorized. I couldn't remember those anymore. But as their leader, I didn't want to admit that I was having a problem, just because I thought they'd tell me I was faking it. I was being a wuss. I wanted to get out of combat. I didn't want to get hurt again. I mean, there's a myriad of reasons why I didn't want to say anything. But everything really started to manifest about 6 months after I got home. Reading my daughter books at night. I was stumbling over first grade words. I couldn't read the way that I used to. Trying to pick up a book, I get 10 pages down the line, or 10 pages into the book, and I can't remember what I read. Just little things like that. And then after about 2 months of getting into my therapy, they did a QEEG on my brain. And they found out that I have a golf ball size patch of dead brain tissue in my memory cortex. And that pretty much made my invisible injury extremely visible for me, because I can actually look at the paper and see the dead brain tissue. So, I mean, that's a story all in itself. That hit me really hard, being able to actually see my injury when I thought it wasn't there. And that's when it all started to manifest.
Thank you for sharing that. And TJ really also shares these experiences in his writing. Tell us a little bit about how writing came into the picture for you after that initial letter that happened to make it into the New York Times.
The initial letter, it fueled a fire. I loved seeing my byline. I mean, that was just, it was a high for me, seeing my byline, especially in the New York Times.
He's already got a journalist ego.
And I wanted to feel it again. And I started keeping, not really a journal, but I just started writing for the hell of it. And it was a way for me to express what I couldn't understand. Because I'd been diagnosed with PTSD back in 2007 after I came back from Iraq, but I never kept going with my therapy. So when everything started to manifest again in 2010 when I came home, writing was a way for me to get everything off my chest. And once I sent something to Finn, and I was like, hey, where do I go with this? What can I do with this? And there's two things that I love. I love my wife, and I love veterans advocacy. Well, don't forget about my daughter. But, and my mom, of course, who's sitting right there.
Nice save.
Yeah, good save. And he said, if you're comfortable, tell your story so that it helps other veterans. And I'm up to about 20 pieces now that have been published. And if I have helped one veteran throughout the entire ordeal, all my effort, all my time, all my tears on the paper is worth it. So it fueled the fire to help other veterans.
It's a great opportunity to welcome your family here.
Yeah,
think
but
the whole
I mean, I
first
love
row
all
is
of you. I
filled
just
with
don't want to
Mom
go down
and
the line.
Dad and everybody. I wanted you all to have a sense of a little bit of TJ's writing, especially as I think part of what makes it unique is that he breaks with some of the taboos that we have. I think on one hand, you could say that this is the first war ever where we have veterans coming back, where PTSD at least is what people talk about, think about. It has to some extent become part of the public language. TJ has a very powerful blog post about he's got a lot of them about PTSD, but one about what it takes to kill a person. There have been lots of conversations that is one of the major differences between the journalists who go to war and the soldiers who go to war, because journalists document. They don't have that ultimate sacrifice to make. And I've asked TJ to read a little bit from this blog post because I think it illustrates both his straightforward, really beautiful prose and what that experience is like.
Go. "200 meters was all that separated me from an insurgent carrying an AK-47. I sat in a dilapidated brown leather chair, recessed in the shadows of a second-story room in the government complex of Fallujah, Iraq. My sights were perfectly centered as I perched my elbows on the desk in front of me. The clear tip traced the center of his chest. He crept around a corner of a mud wall and slowly moved towards our position. Fear built inside of me. I hesitantly began to pull the trigger of my M16. I was scared, to say the least. It was the first time my training would be tested. I heard my rifle crack as I fired. The weapon's recoil nudged my shoulder, and he crumpled to the ground. The aroma of gunpowder filled the room. I fired 2 more rounds into his motionless body, then stared in amazement as his body lay lifeless, his black and red scarf astray. The sun rose across the city skyline. I was 19. For me, the 10th of November is special. It is the Marine Corps' birthday, a day for celebrating camaraderie. But it is also a day, 8 years ago, when I was pinned down in the relentless firefights of Operation Phantom Fury. It is the day that I took a person's life for the first time. These 2 drastically different events make for mixed emotions at that time of year. In 2004, fighting in a large-scale attack on the Corps' birthday was thrilling. I'd be lying if I said that I was not still motivated by the memory. What better way to celebrate 229 years of decorated service than to take part in writing the Corps' next chapter? But I also feel as though I lost a part of myself that day. Taking someone's life brings you to the darkest side of yourself. There are nights when I see the faces of the people I killed. There are days when I get lost in vivid memories of violent combat for minutes at a time. But it also leaves you emotionally numb. In the last 8 years, I have not been able to cry unless I reminisce about Fallujah. It is as if my brain has created a space where feelings were lost or delayed. And when I did feel emotion after killing, it was often a sense of relief that I was not on the receiving end. An emotion that might readily but incorrectly be interpreted as satisfaction. It was easy then to fall back on my powerful logic that it was either me or them, or worse yet, one of my fellow Marines. But that logic leaves questions with no easy answers. Did I in some way come to enjoy killing? Was the loss of life and my innocence worth it? Pulling the trigger for the first time was beyond difficult, but the more I had to do it, the easier it became. With each passing trigger pull, I lost more and more of my innocence. In fact, I actually started to get used to slaying bodies, as we called killing the enemy back then. And as more and more of my comrades were injured or killed, the sweeter the revenge began to taste. Looking back on it now, I feel bad that I did not feel bad. The firefights were intense. Some of them lasted hours. The enemy had mastered complex ambushes and attacked us from multiple positions at once, which truly tested my leadership. The fear was real. The bullets were real. I loved it, and with time, my men did too. Taking someone's life changes you whether you like to admit it or not. It took me a long time to notice and admit the changes within me. It is something most people will never have to do, and I am envious of those people. I look back on taking an insurgent's life, and I can't help but think I went a little crazy from doing so. I wonder from time to time what I was like before that day many years ago, but I also realize I will never be that person again.
Thank you, TJ. Very much a taboo subject that we don't talk about, even though it happens in those wars every day.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
We were sitting in my apartment this afternoon going through some of TJ's old photo albums, and he didn't realize it, but we stumbled across a picture of him taken on that morning. Do you mind if I just put it on the screen? That's the scene that he was just describing.
So, TJ, tell us a little bit about why you felt you had to break that taboo. Why did you have to write this piece?
There's nothing more aggravating to a veteran than somebody walking up. I mean, everybody says thank you for your service, but anybody who's served knows that usually the next question that comes after that is, have you ever killed somebody? And it's probably the most aggravating thing ever, because that's a personal battle that you wage with yourself, taking somebody's life. And after being published a few times in the New York Times, I figured it was time to show people that there are battles that we face inside of ourselves when it comes to killing people. Some of us feel like murderers. Some of us feel like we did the wrong thing. Some of us feel like we did the right thing. But I hoped by writing this article that it would show people the emotional turmoil that we go through after killing someone. And maybe they won't have to ask that question because they'll know the answer, that it should be something left to that individual.
And what were some of the responses that you got to the piece?
I had a couple personal emails sent to me. One was from a professor at NYU. Another was from a professor at, there was NYU, CUNY, and another college in New York. And they said they were going to make it mandatory reading for their psychology class, which was extremely flattering. And just, I got emails from veterans saying thank you for telling our story. I got emails from parents who had lost their children to the wars saying thank you. I got emails from people with PTSD saying, this is amazing, you're a voice for all of us. So it made it extremely worth the effort.
Thank you. So Finbarr, you had crawled into TJ's life to some extent, being an embedded reporter. Now TJ was starting to crawl into the life of a journalist. What did that feel like? And you ended up mentoring TJ and helping him initially with some of his work. What convinced you he would have a future in this profession?
He asks a lot of questions. No, we had many long talks around that campfire at Kunjak, and we talked late into the night, lying on those bunks. And aside from the quality of the writing when I saw it, I do remember distinctly one evening, he asked me kind of an awkward question early on, when I still didn't know him that well. And he said, so, if you had a chance to interview Osama bin Laden, would you? And I thought, oh, here we go. So how do I answer this? And often we have to kind of tiptoe around these things as journalists and with people who we're reporting on. Not that you want to lie necessarily, but you need to just be careful about how you answer something, because you understand that your institutional perspectives on something like that might be so different as to be impossible to reconcile. And so I think I gave some wishy-washy, kind of ambiguous, I can't remember what it was now, but it was pathetic. And he's just like, he just looked at me and said, "What kind of journalist are you, man? I'd do that interview in a second." And then I was like, "Yeah, okay, all right. So you're a better journalist than me already." But it just gave me a sense that he hadn't sort of entered into that military mindset of the enemy is not human, programmed to just eliminate something that's almost not human. And even though at that point, I guess you could say that bin Laden symbolized everything that this American military force was geared towards exterminating, he was still able to see past that to another level where there is a value in just talking with people and listening to people and telling their side. And I didn't think that, you know, a Marine who I'm lying with in Afghanistan beside, and just say, you know, it's worth hearing this person out. So that already very early on suggested to me that he had a perspective that was perhaps not one we might assume about a Marine. And then, you know, that Marine ambush with that story, the first story, okay, so this guy, he'd mentioned that he likes writing, and his mom had emailed me to say, "Oh, TJ's enjoying your talks. He used to like writing." And, you know, moms are supposed to say that, right? So you don't know what, not that I don't trust you, but, you know, I don't trust you. No. So it's one of those things where you don't know when somebody says, "Yeah, I like writing." I was like, okay, yeah. But then he wrote that piece, and I thought, he actually had something. It was moving already for me, but I was biased in that sense. But then when he started sending me his memoirs, memoirs or journal entries that he was working on as part of his therapy as he moved through this very difficult process of dealing with his PTSD and his traumatic brain injury, I realized that what he was struggling with was the same issue that so many other people were struggling with. And it's one thing for a journalist to write about that kind of issue from the outside, but if somebody can write about that from the inside, having had that experience themselves, that is far more valuable. And it's why it would have been talked about at the Columbia Awards discussion last week, because it's very rare that we have somebody writing about trauma as the traumatized person, but doing it in such a way that we can understand it. And I thought there was something very valuable there for him to say, and he had the tools to say it. All he needed was a bit of kind of journalist boot camp, basically, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, we made it work. Those first, you know, the first couple of pieces he sent me in, I said, "Great, this is really great stuff in here. This is your story. How do we make this into something that is representative of everybody else's story who's in the same situation?" And I kept sending stuff back to him and saying, "Well, develop this, develop that." And each time he came back with better and better stuff until it was this giant story that was way too big to run anywhere. And then, you know, I finally said, "Well, great, you've got all the elements. Now cut it down from 5,000 words to 900 words." And he just sort of, we were Skyping at the time. I was in Senegal where I'm based, and he was at home. And he's like, "How do I do that?" And, "Well, it's not my problem now. You got to do that." That was a Wednesday. Thursday afternoon, I got an email that was 1,100 words, and he actually had got it right down. He'd cut off all the extra stuff, and he'd narrowed this thing down. And then we just sort of ironed out a few wrinkles, and it ran pretty much like that as his first piece for the At War blog. And
So TJ, when I asked you earlier about, you know, how did you decide to become a journalist once you would retire from the Marines, you told me about the influence that Finbarr has had on that decision. It would be great if you could share that a little bit with everybody else.
He planted the seed when he was telling me about how he reported on Congo and reported on all these global issues that nobody really knew about. So that got me interested, because I was like, how much more is there that we don't know about that needs to be told? And then as I was writing my first piece, I was like, this is fun, this is great, this is therapeutic. And just, I mean, seeing that byline and seeing what a difference it made for him to get, I mean, we usually Skyped because it's free, but my phone rang 2 minutes after he saw it, and he called me all the way from Senegal, so I know that wasn't cheap. And
well, yeah, my company pays for that.
oh, well,
I don't care that much.
But I mean, just starting out, I'd never been to journalism school. Before, I was working towards my associates in business management at an online college, so I wasn't what I thought New York Times material. I didn't have the I didn't have the self-esteem with my writing yet. And he kept pushing me that way. Like, don't get a fat head, but this is really good. Don't get a fat head, but you're doing this part right. And then him just pointing me, I called him Professor Finbarr, because like just the way that he mentored me and taught me, but just how supportive he was throughout the entire process of me learning how to write is what cemented it in my mind that I wanted to be a journalist, and I wanted to pretty much follow in his footsteps.
So, Professor Finbarr, just as you...
You can keep calling me that, by the way.
We'll all call you that from now on. Just as you started developing this relationship with TJ and really giving him the journalism bug, something else happened in your own approach to your work. You started to lose faith in the power of photography and the power of journalism, maybe. And in a talk at the Nieman Foundation recently, you said that you had lost your muse. Talk to us a little bit about that. What happened?
So he gets the easy questions.
Yes, you get the hard ones. You have so much more experience with this.
So I think part of the reason why I was, aside from TJ being a talented writer, but one of the reasons why I was interested in helping him was because I was also kind of struggling at the time as well. In that I'd been covering conflict for pretty much 4 or 5 years steadily, and it was at a time where people who I know in the business, Joao got injured in Afghanistan, and then 2 other friends of mine were killed in Libya not long after I was with them. And that had a big impact on our small little community of people who do this kind of work. And so I started questioning the risk to return ratio of what we were doing, because it's one thing for me to make the decision to go and be in these places and have these experiences that are powerful and I wouldn't say addictive, but there's the combat high. I mean, it's a difficult. It's like, you know, it's that heroin thing. How do you ever experience anything as intense as that first high? And so what you find is that it becomes easier and easier to find that war environment normal, and more difficult to find a normal environment, one that you can fit into easily, or the day-to-day stuff, the trivial things, answering emails, filing your expenses, going to the supermarket. All those things become very tedious, and so you keep going back to these conflict areas because that feels like it makes sense to you in some twisted way. And the death of my friends in Libya really shook that foundation in a way, and a lot of other people in this industry as well. I'm not alone there. But I really started to question why I was doing this kind of thing. Was it just so selfish that it was just for me? Are the pictures worth that? Is the story that I'm telling worth not just putting myself at risk, but all the people who around me? Because when Chris and Tim were killed in Libya, you really saw the fallout for their family, for their friends. And those are not people who made the decision to be there. And that really had an impact on me. And so I really felt like I lost some desire to do that kind of work at that point.
Is that what made you apply for a Nieman Fellowship?
Yeah, I really felt like I needed to understand the thinking behind what it is that we do as journalists. And a good way to do that was to examine the psychology of how the brain works. What happens when we're exposed over a long period of time to trauma, to combat, and the chemical impact that has on the brain, and the physical impact that things like traumatic brain injuries have on the brain, and how that influences emotions and behavior and mood and these kinds of things. All these kinds of issues that so many veterans are struggling with, and to some extent many journalists and people in the media as well.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to take questions after this last question, so please prepare for it. We have 2 running mics that we'll be using. So one of your ways of dealing with it now that you are on the Nieman Fellowship, that you've had the opportunity to study, to learn more about it, is that you and TJ now want to write a book?
Yeah, we'd like to. I mean, I've been studying psychology while I'm here. I've got involved with the psychology lab that the professor has asked me to draw up the design for an experiment that we're now, we've completed the design and we're submitting for funding, and it is an experiment that deals with combat veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan and how to reverse the effects of PTSD and trauma. And for about a year, I've had this idea that TJ and I should do something together to use our combined stories, his experience in the military and mine as a journalist in these kinds of areas. But I'm not just interested in really just writing only a memoir to tell more war stories. I would like to use that, our story, our combined story, our friendship, as a narrative vehicle to explore the issues, the psychological issues involved that are facing the military, the media, but society at large as well. Because as these guys come home, it's causing strain on families and on communities and on society at large.
Very good. So let's take your questions. Please
Hi,
introduce
guys.
yourself.
Hey, Natalie.
My name is Natalie Jordy, and I have a question for TJ. TJ, thanks for coming today. Thank you for your service also. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, war. It's a messy business, right? And as a bystander in this country, it's really hard to know what to think. It sort of depends on what media you read or listen to. And I'm wondering if you can talk about whether your thoughts on going to war changed from what they were before you went, and how they evolved over time.
So you're basically wondering why I joined at 18 and whether or not those ideals changed over time?
I'm interested in that, but my specific question is about sort of why our nation went to war and what your thoughts were on that before you went out there to fight that war, and how those may or may not have changed over time.
Initially, why did they go to war?
Your perceptions of why they went to war.
Yeah, my perception as to why they went to war. I genuinely believe when we went to Afghanistan, we were looking for Osama bin Laden. Why we stayed there so long, I have no idea. But when I joined the Marine Corps, I wanted to defend our country, all the hoorah stuff. And that definitely changed over time. I vividly, one of the few things that I remember from the day that I got hurt, the image of me sitting up against the wall, I remember thinking, why the F did I do this? Why did I join the Marine Corps? Why did I want to go to war? I regretted it right then, right there, and I thought it was a huge mistake. And I think I'm not answering your question, but it's an inner struggle. Like, you realize you're doing good by going to war. You're supporting the man to your right and your left. But at the same time, you realize that, you're going to have to take that life, and you're going to carry that with you for the rest of your life. So, did it change over time? Yeah. But I don't remember exactly how I felt at 18. So I'm sorry.
But from what I've gleaned from being around people in the military is that you're not thinking about the bigger picture most of the time. Like you said,
No.
You're thinking about the guy to your left. You're thinking about the guy to your right. Your world shrinks from national agendas, down and down and down. But you're not even thinking about what the rest of your battalion is doing, or even the rest of your company. TJ was really just thinking about his 10 guys, and that's it. How do you look after them? How do you make sure they get through this patrol safely? How do they get through this this whole deployment in one piece? And the guilt that you dealt with the fact that 3 of your guys got hurt, even though it's no fault of your own. You didn't make any wrong decisions, but that's still something you have to struggle with. So really, the idea of why people went to war in the first place, it sort of narrows right down to this tiny little sphere of influence. And it's just that guy and that guy. And the guys you're sharing that immediate space.
What he said.
You take Jen and then the gentleman over there.
Hi, I'm Jen McDonald. I'm a Nieman Fellow. Thank you for coming, TJ. You're a military affairs reporter now,
Yes.
and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your new job. And writing personal essays is very different from being a reporter. And so I'm curious about the sorts of stories you're covering and how you approach them, and what it feels like, or how you navigate going from sort of subject of your own writing to observer of other people and institutions.
Basically, 50% of what I write deals with national context. We'll take a large story about the Department of Veterans Affairs, and we'll localize it by asking local veterans, local military, how they feel about it. And it's the other half is whatever's going on Camp Lejeune that day. Usually it's boring, dumb news, but that's besides the point. It's difficult being on the outside because you know how the Marine Corps works. You know how secluded they are. You know how much they don't want to tell you things, but you know the truth because you used to be part of it. So it's extremely frustrating trying to get answers when you know there's more to the story, or they're just closing you out because you're media. So me being the former Marine, I pull the punk card sometimes. And I'll be like, listen, somebody did this. Either A, do a press release, or B, I'm just going to go with it. And less than 24 hours later, I'll have a press release because they know that. But it makes me miss the Marine Corps every single day. That's the hardest part about the job because I didn't leave on my terms. I left medically. I was forced out. So that's the hardest part of the job. And that's my beat.
Thank you. My name's Scott Brower. I'm a photographer. I've got a question. I'm having a hard time figuring out how to articulate this, but it's about the act and nature of documentation and how that fits in with your life and your experience of war. TJ, I imagine that this photo had a very different role for you when you took it compared with what it means to you now. Likewise, your writing and just how you process it. It seems like documentation is therapeutic to you. Finbarr, on the other hand, documentation is your experience of war, I guess, right? And it sounds like, to some extent, the act of documentation, that was your muse, that was what you were doing, and you've lost faith in that, and what role documentation has in you kind of trying to work through this and deal with this, and I guess that's it. I'm trying to figure out just what documentation can do for the journalists, for the soldiers, for the corpsmen, both before, during, and after experiencing something like this.
I don't remember that photo being taken. I can imagine why it would have been taken because I probably wanted to look like a badass in a photo for when I got old. But it's hard for me to look at photos from Iraq because a lot of them contain pictures of fallen Marines that were my friends. So documentation allows, I look at those photos in two ways. I'm sad and I feel humbled at the same time. I'm sad because I miss my friends, but I'm humbled because they taught me something, and through therapy I learned to look at what they taught you before they lost their lives. So I gained something by them losing their lives, and I try to honor them every day. So looking at them gives me those two dynamics. But at the same time, looking at photos that Finbarr took of me getting hurt, those pain me, very much so, because I remember what I used to be like. I remember, my mom called it my memory bank, and I was borderline photographic when it came to memorizing things. And now I'm not like that anymore. So studying for school is depressing. I recently tried to read a book that Finbarr gave me, And I got about halfway through, and I almost wanted to light the book on fire because I couldn't remember a damn thing that I read. So documentation is painful, and it's good at the same time for me.
Do you feel, though, if you put your emotions, you being the subject, obviously, of the photos, in the bigger context, in your specific case, obviously, everybody has to answer this question individually, but do you feel that it's worth it? That, you know, the video of you getting injured is out there on YouTube?
Yes, it is 150% worth it.
And why is that?
Because it goes back to the night before I got injured. People don't know. Mainstream America, in my opinion, is disconnected from the war. I was watching, don't judge me, but it was on Fox, and they were asking everyday Americans, like, are we still in Afghanistan? And they were like, no, we stopped going there 2 years ago. We pulled out 2 years ago. We pulled out 3 years ago. They had no idea what was going on. And I mean, I got hurt after we supposedly got pulled out of Afghanistan. So stories like what he told, they enlighten mainstream America as to what the hell's going on. So that's why I think it's beneficial. I mean, I don't care how much stuff hurts me as long as it helps other people.
Okay, lots of questions. We haven't had one from here.
Max Morrow. TJ, you mentioned that the writing is therapeutic for you in terms of the PTSD. Could you just tell us a little bit about what is offered to veterans for treatment of PTSD, and perhaps even if you could devise a program or what you think should be offered, what might that be?
Do you want me to cover the treatment that I got while I was in the military, or do you want me to talk on what's available for veterans? Or a little bit of both?
Yeah, no, what a veteran would get
Okay.
Be offered on returning.
I got out December 30th. I put my enrollment paperwork into the Department of Veterans Affairs February 1st. I have my first appointment June 17th. And now,
That is the story.
what happens if I need mental health treatment? I don't know of anything else that's out there. And I got hospitalized for my PTSD right before New Year's because I was just extremely depressed about leaving the Marine Corps. I called the VA. The VA told me that they couldn't help me because I wasn't a veteran yet. I called the Army because I was living near an Army base and said, hey, can you fit me in? They said no, because I was on terminal leave, so they couldn't help me. And the psychiatrist or the social worker that I was seeing, their office was closed. So I figured, hey, I'll go there's got to be a psychologist on duty at the hospital. I'll just go there and say I need help. Well, they locked me up for 4 days because they didn't want me to be a veteran statistic for suicide. A lot of people get disability for PTSD from the VA. But I think me personally, if I was to devise a program, I would make it mandatory that at least once a month, veterans who collect for mental disabilities have to be seen by a psychologist, have to be seen by a social worker. Something in that realm of mental health treatment. Because 22 veterans a day killing themselves, that's horrible. That is absolutely unsatisfactory. And it goes back to me not being able to get an appointment for 6 months. What do I do?
Excellent.
I hope that answered your question, by the way.
So Betsy, and then I'm trying to see the people behind there.
Hi, I'm Betsy O'Donovan. I'm a Nieman Fellow. I'm really glad we brought up treatment for PTSD. Finbarrs, I'm interested in the research study you've mentioned and the kind of work that you guys are going to be focused on, and how it might help veterans or people who are coming back with symptoms of PTSD. I'd also like to hear from TJ about what has been effective in dealing with PTSD. I mean, obviously, you know, it's an ongoing process, but you're doing something, and it would be interesting to know what works.
Okay.
So yeah, okay. So I can't go into too much detail about the actual experiment because it's a bit elaborate for this setting. But essentially, it's the study is constructed so that it would take combat veterans back in time to a target year prior to their combat experience and try and turn the clock back on them having experienced combat and experienced the associated trauma. And but ultimately, what the thinking is that there's no single thing that is going to cure PTSD or to treat it and eradicate it. Although there are some interesting treatments that are, possibly in that realm at the moment. But ultimately, it's going to be a number of different types of therapy combined in different ways at different times to treat people who are suffering from this problem. And then there's also a whole issue of whether you call it a disorder or an injury. That's another big debate that's going on within the realm of psychology at the moment as well. Because a disorder is something that's congenital, it's something that you have, whereas PTSD is something that you get, it's inflicted upon you by it's a physical injury to the brain. And that's why traumatic brain injuries exacerbate PTSD so much. But the thinking is that clearly, as we just heard, what the VA is doing and what the military is doing for its active and retired members is woefully insufficient for the state of affairs, and all these guys coming back from a decade of constant war. So something does need to be done, and the study that we're looking at doing is kind of one of those things. But a whole lot more needs to be kind of, there has to be a massive shift, but it's an institution where institutions are very slow in making shifts. Even in the sort of field of psychology, it's slow to make shifts in thinking about things. So there are a number of new kinds of treatment that are fairly recent that could prove to be very effective in treating the kinds of problems that a lot of military members are facing at the moment. So what's been the most effective stuff for you so far?
Well, I would like to say that the Navy medicine, because if you're in the Marine Corps, you're Department of the Navy, so Navy medicine is who treats us. Navy medicine does an absolutely phenomenal job treating Marines if they say they have PTSD. Now I'll go back. If they say they have a problem, if they ask for help, the screening process sucks. If you say, I'm not sleeping at night, if you say, I'm having nightmares, if you say, I'm doing this, I mean, they hit you hard with therapy and all the good stuff. So it goes back to what you asked me. If you ask for help, you're going to get it, and it's going to be damn good. What has worked for me is prolonged exposure, which is a type of therapy. It brings you to the brink of insanity by having you tell your most traumatic experience to the point where you disassociate and you have a flashback. Well, you're living a flashback, but they stop you and bring you back and get you reorientated with the room. And then they force you to tell it again until you disassociate, and then they bring you back. And each time I noticed that I was making it further and further and further into my story without disassociating. So I was desensitizing myself to it. And eventually, I was able to tell my entire story. And then the fun stuff started again because we picked another traumatic incident. And then we started telling that one, and I'd disassociate again, and we'd work our way through and through and through. So I think by the time, in the year and 9 months that I was in treatment in the Marine Corps, I made it through 3 traumatic experiences that I can now recite to you guys without sweating and disassociating and all that stuff. But I still have more. So I'd be lying if I said I looked forward to doing prolonged exposure, but I know it makes me better in the long run. And then you had a second part to your question.
Before you get to the second part, so that's one way of doing things, but there's a whole side of psychology that says that this is actually the wrong way to treat people, that you're re-exposing them to trauma unnecessarily, and that talk therapy and exposure therapy are the wrong way to go about it because you keep exposing them to trauma, And yes, you desensitize them to the traumatic events, but you desensitize them to everything else as well. So that ends up desensitizing them and numbing them to the ability to have normal relationships with family, with wives, with children. And so there's an argument against that form of treatment as well. And you have these big debates that are going within the field of psychology and within, even within the VA and the different departments who are treating these kinds of mental health issues in the military and outside the military. So there's a whole kind of world here that exists beyond, this is how we should treat it. They're all, there's a new one right now that we were talking about with the leading psychologist the other day that was found by an anesthetologist who was anesthetizing a nerve here and was sticking a needle down inside to, I've forgotten the name of it, what's it called, the ganglion nerve. Anyway, it's a nerve blocker. Yeah, and essentially it kills PTSD in one shot. Gone.
But it does come back.
But it does come back. But then you go get another shot. So it's only been done on 100 people so far. But it's, but it's a very new form of treatment, and it's not known exactly how it can work. But these are the kinds of things and the kinds of advances that are happening within the field of psychology. They're actually really interesting. It's what I'm interested in the moment.
I think what helps, if you go there, then I would just like to provide a little bit of context in that we've only been studying this kind of trauma for the past 35 or 40 years, depending on how you look at it, right? We all know shell shock. People knew it existed. But the actual studying of the process, with the scientific method is much, much younger than that. And there's great disagreement. PTSD is a wanting definition to begin with, post-traumatic stress disorder, not just because of the name, but because initially it was something that a group, the group that was assigned to define that thing that is trauma could agree on. But everybody knows that it is wanting. PTSD, for example, is a single incident disease, which means it's a one-time car accident. Prolonged complex trauma is absolutely not covered by it. Also the fact that depending on a lot of different factors, people have PTSD, or the way that, what we call it now, expressed in very different ways, is not covered by it. So there's that overall, there's the term that we use, and there's, a science about that, but then there's many sub-layers. For example, as we had earlier, the fact that you had to kill somebody has a very, very different effect on how you experience or what PTSD is for you compared to people who have been raped. So just in terms of context, those things are important when we ask about treatments. Each individual's response to trauma is different, and not everybody is affected by PTSD in the first place. And then B, the treatment that works for you is also different for, depending on those different factors. So there's a blonde lady in the back. Oh, and Kevin after that. Sorry.
Hi, my name's Catherine. I'm a senior here, and while at Harvard, my studies have focused on interpretations of personal narratives of POW captivity and escape. And I'm also very interested in being a writer, and I'm probably going to work for David Brooks at the New York Times this coming year. And so I would love to get your perspective on, you have two different ways of writing about war. You have people who've never lived through war and try to apply their own understanding to various, primary materials that are there. And then you also have people who have been through war and they know what it's like to be there. However, with both sets of people writing, you have various biases which make it difficult to, really get at what is the truth of being in war and what are kind of larger themes that you can draw from the study of and the history of war. So I'd love to kind of get your opinion on how can you really find kind of the heart of the matter, what the truth of the issues are when you're approaching it from both sides.
I mean, I guess the simple answer is that the story that either of us would try to tell in terms of the project that we're looking to work on together is we're looking to tell our own story and our own experience of conflict and of combat. In terms of reporting, I'm not a soldier, so I'm an observer. When I'm in Afghanistan, I'm not a combatant. And so I bring a perspective that's going to be very different from, say, a military reporter which is what TJ is now, and you actually wrote an entire piece on this for the New York Times, about the difference between a journalist such as myself with no military training or background going into a conflict zone and covering the war, as opposed to somebody like TJ. If he went back now as a journalist and covered the conflict, his reporting would be very, aside from just personal styles, but his perspective is going to be very different from my own. But I think ultimately what is important about it is that everyone is going to bring their own perspective as a writer, as a journalist, to telling a story. So it depends on the project. When I'm writing for Reuters, when I'm photographing, it's more my own view. If I'm writing for Reuters, a news service, it's less of a personal view. It's a news style, neutral, objective style. And the kind of writing that TJ's been doing for the New York Times is very personal. But as we found out, he's got to do the objective stuff as a reporter now. So I think to understand war, you need to have all these different perspectives, whether it's from a civilian perspective, doing research with primary material, or it's people who've actually gone through the experience of war, either as a combatant or as a journalist. All of these perspectives are valuable and bring something else to the conversation. And the more voices that we have looking at this, I would say the better. So be interested to see what you end up writing.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, sure.
I think that whether or not you've been to war, you're entitled to your own perspective on that. But one thing to keep in consideration is that Finn and I, we were both pinned down in that alleyway together. We both remember it two separate ways. We have our, common memories that are the same, but he says 45 minutes. I think it was more like 20. So everybody's going to have their own perspective on what they witnessed at war. So everybody's going to have their own feelings on what war is and how they write it. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
So Kevin and then Laura. Kevin? In the back.
TJ, we haven't met, but we've spoken on the phone. I'm Kevin Cullen from the Boston Globe. I don't have a question for you, TJ, as much as I have an answer to one of your questions. You said that if you help one vet, it's worth it, what you've done. Well, I believe you've helped more than one. I know for a fact you've helped one because his name is Tim Pizzuti, and I know he's read your blog because I told him to, and I know the blog has helped him because he told me it has. And I know this because Tim Pizzuti is my cousin, my nephew. And Tim joined the 10th Mountain Division probably the same reason you joined the Marines. And he went over there and he wanted to do the right thing. And part of his service to this country was being hit several times in the head by IEDs. And all Tim wanted to be when he got back from the service was a cop. But when he came back, no police department would touch him because he was diagnosed with PTSD and TBI. Our family struggled mightily with him to show him the love and support he needed. But the VA it was hard, but we eventually he got down to the Charlotte, and his girlfriend, now his wife, is from that area. And he stuck with the program, and he got better. And I know part of his healing and part of his therapy is what you write. And you should know that, and you should be proud of it. And, there are we talk about a lot of guys and women in our service that don't turn out great because they struggle and they don't get the services they need, and we all know that. But I would like you to know that last month, Timmy Pizzuti became a member of the Charlotte Fire Department. He's an EMT. So for him, I thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, guys, so much for your presentation tonight. I'm Laura Weitz-Munoz. I'm also a Nieman Fellow. And I wanted to ask you, TJ, about your experience talking and interviewing other Marines, not the higher-ups, not the flaks, as we call them, but the actual guys, who are enlisted, and how they view you and what your interaction has been.
How about the higher up who told the battalion?
I'll try to keep this PG, but I had a current, when I was still on active duty when I wrote like 7 of my outwar pieces. and I want to say he's a colonel or a lieutenant colonel or something like that with public affairs, basically chewed me out for getting published. And, you know, I can't repeat what he said to me, not in this forum. So, pardon me?
I said we can beep it.
So it's been both supportive and derogatory at the same time. I'd probably say like 60% supportive, 40% derogatory, if I had to put a percentage on it. But I've gotten, like I said before, I've gotten a lot of emails from junior level enlisted and lower level officer saying thank you for what I've written. So, I mean, no matter what a lieutenant colonel says to me about my writing, who's just jealous that I got published in the New York Times and he didn't, I mean, it meant a lot to whoever responded to me and then to his nephew. So, I mean, that's all that matters to me.
But it's mostly the senior guys who
Most of the senior guys who they have a problem with it.
And there's that one who
I'm
told
airing
you.
the Corps' dirty laundry, if you may. And they didn't like that.
There's a senior guy who told the whole battalion not to talk to you, right?
Oh yeah, the unit that I used to be with when women were allowed into the infantry, when they opened that up, I reached out to a couple people that I knew and I asked them for their opinion on it. And I told them, hey, you know, you might want to run this by public affairs first, but if you don't, hey, I'll talk to you. And you know, they told me everything I needed to know, and I put it in a piece, and it ran in the New York Times. Well, a week later, the sergeant major, who's the highest enlisted at the battalion level, pulled the entire battalion in and said, hey, there's a sergeant named James Brennan. You will not talk to him ever again. So I'm off limits to my old unit just because I'm in the media.
So you're actually doing your job.
Yeah, you know, pissing people off means you're doing a good job.
So 2 last questions. We have a gentleman in the back right there next to you, Alan. Pardon?
My name's Tom. I'm a Navy chaplain. Thank you for both of you. I want to apologize for senior officers and the way they've responded to your pieces. There are entire Marine units at Lejeune being trained in a new technique called mindfulness.
Mm-hmm. That's what the experiment involves as well.
And they're now coming back, and metrics are being applied to their experiences, and there seem to be some initial feedback, positive, that the units that have come back that have been trained in mindfulness and those that have practiced it for 27 minutes a day have actually had a lower rate of PTSD. Recently, a book came out, Resilience, some of you may have read or familiar with, that's tried to tie together various pieces of resiliency from forestry, fisheries, psychology, etc.
Mm-hmm.
TJ, in your experience, entire battalions being trained in meditation practices, mindfulness, do you see this as a way of increasing resiliency? Do you think the Marine Corps is apt to embrace it as a whole? As a Navy chaplain, I can say it doesn't seem very Marine Corps-esque to me. Just got back from Afghanistan myself, and it's hard for me to get my head around it, but I would be interested in your perspective. And based upon what you've learned post-PTSD and TBI, what do you think would have on the front end, have helped you get through this better? What would have made you more resilient?
I learned about mindfulness in therapy. So do I think that that would have been beneficial to me prior to going? I would lean more towards yes. You know, any tool you have in your toolbox before you leave is going to help you out, even if it's just a little bit. I think things like mindfulness can help lower, like you do a test for PTSD where they think it's like 25 questions or something like that, and you rate them on a scale of 1 to 5. And then if you're above a 25, you have PTSD. If you're above a 30, you have like raging PTSD. So if it can lower those numbers, I think anything's worth a try. As far as a boots on the ground opinion, I think you have, while people think that Marines are really mature and whatnot, you still have 19-year-old young men out there who haven't been to combat. They don't know what it's like. So telling them, hey, we're going to prepare you for hopefully not getting PTSD by teaching you meditation, you're going to have that percentage that's going to be like, meditation, what the hell am I doing meditation for? So yes, you'll have some embrace it. No, you won't. I think it's going to come down to the sergeants and the staff sergeants at the mid-level enlisted, and the platoon commanders really pushing down who've had that deployment experience, saying, listen, combat sucks. Anything that we can do to help you before trauma happens is, that's where it's going to start. What was the rest of the question?
Well, maybe I'll just pick up from there. But the experiment that TJ helped me work on in terms of the design, it's a mindfulness experiment. And if mindfulness is basically just noticing new things in a non-judgmental way, and that can include meditation. But it doesn't necessarily have to be meditation. And in fact, people who come back from combat zones are incredibly mindful because they're noticing everything around them. They're looking for IEDs, they're looking for snipers on the rooftops, they're noticing everything around them. But the problem is that that level of mindfulness is threat-seeking mindfulness. And so what this experiment that we're looking at doing is changing the way that mindfulness is applied to a civilian setting so that it's no longer threat-seeking level of mindfulness, and that hyper-awareness of everything is brought into a different kind of realm. And so you can be mindful without the element of meditation being included in it if that's deemed to be too kind of touchy-feely for the military. There are other ways to approach mindfulness that this experiment is addressing in particular.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Anything that we can do to limit the number of troops coming back with PTSD is worth a try. I can't say whether or not mindfulness training would work prior to deployment because I never received it, but if it keeps one person from having to go through the crap that I've gone through over the last 3 years, then by means do it, give it to everybody. The one thing that I think will help lower suicide rates both in and out of the service among the veteran and troop community is better screening afterwards. And that's got to be the biggest thing, because you can slip through the cracks so easily. And I'm sure, being a chaplain, you've seen people slip through the cracks before. And it's just, the screening process is the most important, because right now it's lackluster at best.
So I think the vacuum cleaner is giving us a clear sign up there, but I want to really just take, if you could both get a mic, the lady over here and Chang'e, if you could pose your questions briefly, we'll take both of them at the same time. Why don't you get started?
Okay, I'm Eileen Odom, and I'm an Advanced Leadership Fellow, so I don't have the journalism background. So my question is for you, Finn. If you could just briefly help me understand how the embed process works. If you get to have a decision to make on who you're with and where you are, or you get told where you're going, and then in a broader scale for the kind of work that you've done, how you decide if you're going to be working in Africa or in Afghanistan, how you made those choices.
Okay, it's a fairly long answer to all those, but I'm based in Africa. My role is covering Africa. But when you embed with the military in Afghanistan, you essentially have to have a sense of where you want to go and what you want to do, and then you have to request that from whichever branch of the military, Army, or Marines, or whichever country you want to embed with, the French, or whichever part of the NATO coalition it is. And then you can sort of negotiate where it is you want to go, and then it depends on the flight availability into often very remote areas like this. You're just trying to get to a point where you think there might be something interesting to report on, or that hasn't been reported on, or you're really just trying to find your way to a place where you feel like you can tell a story. and you make those decisions yourself, and it's subject to availability. If they're rotating troops in or out, you're not going to get on a flight, helicopter, lift into these remote places, and then rides on trucks to the different outposts. So it all kind of depends on what they're doing, but if you can, get the right people to agree to where you want to go, but you have to have a sense of what it is you're trying to do. You can't just kind of wander around aimlessly and say, because if you do, they'll send you somewhere you don't want to go and ask you to report on community building projects or things which are valuable but are only part of the story. But what will happen is the public affairs will try to show you, oh, we're building this bridge, we're building this school, and yes, fine, but really what's happening here in the bigger picture. So you have to address all of those things. I can tell you more about that process afterwards if you like.
Last question, Chong-Hae.
Hi, I'm Chong-Hae Lee. I'm also a Nieman Fellow. I'm interested in PTSD to understand as a society how to cope with it. So my question is, like, individually, you said therapy really helps, but as a society, what kind of issues or what kind of recognition about PTSD do you think we still need?
Wow.
Well, I mean, first of all, the amazing thing is that TJ is even talking about this stuff publicly, or because you mentioned early on, if people ask for help, then maybe they'll get it. But the thing is, most of the people don't, certainly in the military, which is an institution built on strength and resilience and not showing weakness. So inherently, you have this giant obstacle to people seeking any kind of help to begin with. So there's a breakdown at the very fundamental level of people getting help. So that's the most sort of basic thing.
I think listening to veterans is going to help. Having more storytelling opportunities, having more, just getting to know a veteran is probably going to be the best thing. If everybody in this room went out and met one veteran and just listened, I mean, they may not tell you about the people they killed, they may not tell you how many people they've killed, but just listening to a veteran's story and hearing what they have to say and hearing what their personal struggles are. Because like me, I mean, some guys who served in Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, whatever, if they hear my PTSD triggers, they may be like, wait, what? Those are completely different from mine. So every veteran is unique. So by listening to as many veterans as you can, that's going to help build, total awareness to what's going on. Because PTSD is a huge issue. And I mean, while I'm just one person telling what's bothering me, there's another veteran out there who's got a completely separate story. So I think just acknowledging veterans and letting them know that you're there is just, I mean, you don't need to say the stereotypical thank you for your service. Not saying that's bad if anybody said that to me tonight, but I mean, just listen to them because they all have a story. They all have a unique story that deserves to be told.
Well, thanks to both of you for sharing your story tonight with us. Please join me.